It's always a joy to have sounds of new life in our church. What a wonderful blessing. I want us to start off our sermon today by reading the second set on our call to worship together, the Noah part. So, from fear to faith, an example set by Noah as it rained for 40 days and nights. As we continue to form our faith on our 40 forward journey. 40. The number of days in the season of Lent. A time when Christians participate in Jesus' ministry and we follow him to the cross. We wonder to ourselves, how might we make ourselves ready for the way of the Lord in the places that we are called to be? We wonder, to what mission is God calling the church? We wonder what is needed for Irving North Christian Church as individuals and as a community to be prepared. Genesis, where our scripture comes from today, roughly translates to origin. And it tells us all the origin stories. It gets our foundation of our faith started. We hear about the origin of the universe and of life and of society. And it helps us to think creatively about how God works in the world. Genesis also is a little unique because there are two voices we see in Genesis. We see the priestly voice and the Yahwehist voice. So in that time period, there were these same stories going around, but just slightly different perspectives or different communities. And the way that Genesis was put together, they took these two voices and merged them into one. So that's why when you look at the creation story at the very beginning, you actually see two creation stories. You see them back to back because you have the priestly version of the creation story and the Yahwehist version of the creation story. Sometimes in Genesis we see stories told back to back, slightly different stories, but the same core idea. And sometimes we see the stories meshed together, like today in the Noah story. So as you read the Noah story, it's a relatively short story, just a couple of chapters long, but we hear these voices kind of go back and forth, and we see parts that are repeated, and it's these two different perspectives that have been merged together to tell one story. In the story of the flood, Israel shares a tradition that we find in many different cultures. We see a flood story that teaches us something about order and chaos in the world. And in these stories, in these different cultures, they often contain water as a symbolism for chaos. And it teaches us about things that happen in the universe that has to do with uncertainty, with fear, with doubt, with the unknown. A flood often portrayed a mass genocide, an ending of people or animals or a part of creation. It may appear to be erratic, but in our story, what we really learn today is it's not just this act of judgment and fear and about human sinfulness, but rather the story takes a unique position when it's reframed and can connect us to a creation story full of life and faith. Instead of reading our specific verses today, I'm going to kind of tell the whole story of Noah as the way it's laid out in our scripture, so we get a bigger perspective instead of just pulling out a piece. As we begin in chapter 5, we see a genealogy. We start from Adam's family and it goes all the way to Noah. Then we move on from this genealogy to sin becoming this cosmic idea. We see a union of gods and humans. And depending on what scholar you read or perspective you read, sometimes this is part of the Noah story, and sometimes it's just inserted right before the Noah story actually starts. It's actually a really interesting few verses, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. But we're not going to super dive into that today. We just want to recognize that it's part of this bigger narrative. And then we finally get to the flood in chapter 6, verse 5. And we start off with the sinfulness of humanity. And sin being a personal, interior thing is what we experience. We also then learn about God's grief over this sin. We see that God is sad and angry because the world has become such a violent place. But then there's Noah, and Noah pleases God. So God then decides to communicate with Noah. And God tells Noah of the violence in the world and how it has just become too much. And then we have instructions for building the ark. And God reveals God's big plan to destroy the earth. And we see God say, I am going to bring a flood of waters on this earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything on earth shall die. It's a pretty intense quote. And this is part of the Noah story. This is that story that we tell the children, and we see the happy, fluffy animals and the happy people and the rainbow. But this is part of it. I'll continue on and not get too hung up on the angry God part. But God does tell Noah in God's big plan to take his family and 2 of every living thing onto the ark, and there will be rain. Then we hit repeat and hear the story again, but this time it just comes in a slightly